Hello, my name is Junlei, and I'll be discussing how architecture does not solely determine social values, but rather participates in their construction. It is shaped by and shapes society in which it exists. Architecture reflects, reinforces, and at times challenges dominant ideologies, but never does so in isolation. This is not a binary issue. Instead, we must understand that architecture as being in constant dialogue with the broader societal, political, and economic forces. It co-produces meaning alongside these forces rather than independently directing them. Architecture can function as a manifestation of values, yet remains embedded within the socio-political systems and cultural practices that shape its production and used to question, does architecture determine social values? Historically, architecture has never been neutral. As Mitrovsky states, design is never neutral, it always serves some agenda. But this agenda can be cultural, political, economical, and in doing so, architecture has been manifested in a material form. From Stalinist Russia or Fascist Italy, monumental buildings, rigid geometries, and grand symmetry were not aesthetic choices. They were political tools used to communicate power, order, and control. But this isn't limited to authoritarian regimes. In democratic and capitalist societies too, architecture governs behavior. Open plan offices promote collaboration but also surveillance. Gated communities promise security but reinforce exclusion. Doucet and Coopers argue that architecture holds agency. It conditions how we move, behave, and relate. From hostile architecture, as Smith and Walters describe, anti-homeless spikes, segmented benches, and leaning bus stops are not just design features, they're acts of symbolic violence. They push certain bodies out of public space, they discipline, they exclude, and they reinforce the idea of non-belonging. But this shaping of values extends beyond exclusion. From the 1950s, the perfect suburban home of white picket fences, tidy lawns, and modern kitchen wasn't just a lifestyle, it was a national symbol. It stood for prosperity, stability, and the nuclear family, and it promised economic growth and moral order, especially during the uncertainty of the atomic age. But these ideals weren't achievable for everyone. They reinforced unrealistic standards in the working class community and enforced the idea of succession, and therefore architecture became a moral instruction. And yet, if architecture reflects values, we must ask, whose values? Bowery reflects on the 19th century public square as a place for gathering, conversation, and connection. Cafes were about people and not performance, community and not consumption. But in this age of supermodernity, tech-driven design, these values have shifted. Spaces lack relational warmth, and shopping becomes a spectacle, cafes become a curated space, and interiors are designed to have no trace of human use. We see this in the privatization of public space. Waterfronts, plazas, and shopping districts are increasingly managed by private interests. Lowen Iverson reminds us that access to public space should never depend on the ability to pay, yet many of these spaces are governed by rights and not rights, but by revenue. And urban design in this way begins to reflect and reinforce economic exclusion. And it's not just about class, gender is embedded in space too. Sandra J notes that architecture has a long center of male body and as a measure of scale, proportion, and legitimacy. From the classical temples to modern institutions, space has been framed as masculine, public, rational, and strong. But in doing so, it marginalizes others. Women, non-binary people, and the queer communities are made invisible and or out of place. Still, architecture isn't a tool of conformity, it can be a site of resistance. Boutiques, for example, have reflected subcultural identities. Pimlott writes about how boutique retail spaces can be immersive performance, salespeople dressed like customers, and stores sold not just products but a lifestyle, an identity, and a way of being. But over time, these aesthetics were co-opted, absorbed by the mass markets. What began as a rebellion became a commodity, and the counterculture became a trend. This reflects the architecture's dual role. It doesn't just mirror society, but it participates in constructing it. Architecture is not a deterministic force. Webb and Williams argue that design is shaped by planning regulations, client demands, and budget constraints. Architects often respond to these dominant values and don't just invent them, and users aren't passive either. Doucet and Coopers emphasize that people resist, reinterpret, and play with space. A mall can become a protest, a bench can become a bed, and a plaza can become a home. So where does that leave us? Architecture is not just a backdrop, it can reinforce dominant ideologies or challenge them,